Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 8, article 2, where we're willing not only goods, but goods specifically as a means or an end, and how means and end relate to each other. So we're going to primarily need to define what we mean when we say means and end and how they work, and very closely related to that is to distinguish two different kinds of good, the goods that correspond with means and end. And so I've put the phrasing over here on the right. I think it'll be helpful to actually talk through the terms a little bit before we jump into the article, and then keep these in mind as we go along. When we say end in English, when we give that as our translation for Aquinas, Aquinas just has finis. It's very simple. End is a very reasonable way to translate that. But Aquinas does not have a single word for when we say means. He actually has this phrase, those things which are toward an end, eaque sunt ad finem. And in some ways, you might think of this article as justifying that translation that we make. Why do we turn this phrase, eaque sunt ad finem, into a single word, means? What are we trying to express there? That's what this article is about. Closely connected with the means and end language is a way of dividing up good into at least two different kinds. We're simplifying a little bit. There are more things to say about goods. But in a very basic way, you can talk about a bonum honestum, something that's just good, just wanted in itself, without reference to something else, or a useful good, a bonum utile. And when you say that something is a bonum utile, you mean that it is good for something, or it is wanted for something. When you're wanting it, it's for the sake of something else, or with reference to some other thing. And that very, very directly tracks with the difference between means and end. So the objections in this article are a bit scattered, and we really only care about one of them, and that's objection 2. The first objection does bring up, though, the general question, and it does show us the direction Aquinas is going to go, so it's worth at least glancing at it. And also, we're going to see again, like we talked about in the previous video, this confusion between the terms voluntas, which is what Aquinas uses, and volition, an English translation choice that we make. And as often, we will be skipping the third objection, and we'll talk about why when we see it. So here's the text of objection 1. It would seem that volition, although Aquinas has voluntas there, it would seem that voluntas is not only of the means, but of the end only, for the philosopher says that voluntas is of the end, while choice, electio, is of the means. Well, we know from the basic operating procedures for Aquinas that means he's going to say that's not right, that it actually is both somehow, although the reply here is a little bit trickier than just negating the objection. You can think of this objection as just a counter sed contra. There's really not much to it. Aristotle himself gives a distinction between voluntas, lining that up with end, and choice, or election, lining that up with means. There's not a lot there for us to address. It's really just a why are we even talking about this kind of objection. When we're done, you should be able to see for yourself that this objection is solved by the respondeo. You should also be able to see, I hope, that this objection doesn't make much sense at all in English as we've translated it. Once you've chosen to give the word volition and define volition as being of the end, then the question is a little strange. So it's important to keep coming back to what Aquinas was asking, which is whether the voluntas is of the means or the end. The other thing to say here is that electio, or choice, will be very important in question 13. We are coming back to this. So for that reason alone, perhaps, we should glance at the objection. But that's really all we need here. We will not come back to it at the end of the article. Now, objection 2 matters quite a bit. This is really what the respondeo is going to be about. For objects differing in genus, there are corresponding different powers of the soul, Aristotle. Now, the end and the means are in different genera, genuses, of good, because the end, which is a good of either rectitude or of pleasure, is in the genus quality or action or passion, whereas the good which is useful and is directed to an end is in the genus relation, Aristotle again. Therefore, if volition, voluntas, is of the end, it is not of the means. This one is worth talking about, and it's really a continuation of the previous article, Question 8, Article 1, in our last video. We said that every power has its proper object. Here we're essentially working in reverse. When you have different objects or proper objects, you must have different powers. Genus here just means kind of thing, or genera, kinds of things. And so we can really just restate it like this, that if you have one kind of object, object kind 1, then that must correspond with power 1, and a second object kind must correspond to a second power. And you could do lots of different kinds of examples there. You could sub in, as we're going to see later in the article, we could talk about sight and hearing. We could talk about sensing and intellection. Talk about many different kinds of things. Particulars and universals can be known by different powers, things like that. But for the objection itself, relatively simple claim. The end is one kind of good, and the means is another. They're different kinds of goods. Because to just be good or just wanted is different than being wanted for something. There must be two different powers in play. We could try to illustrate the difference with some goofy story of a pen. If I say, I want that pen, and you say, why do you want the pen? And I say, I want to write on the board. That's a useful good. Right? I want to write on the board, and I'm willing the pen as a means to that, as a useful good. Whereas if I say I want that pen, and you say, why do you want that pen? And I say, I just like pens. I don't know. I just like pens a lot. I want it. Now I'm just willing it for its own sake. It's not because I want to do anything with it. I just want it. I want to possess it. Those are different kinds of things, pretty markedly different. And the objector is claiming they're different species. They're different kinds of things, and therefore there's two different powers. Objection 3, the main reason we're going to skip it because as usual we skip objections that are about habits. But I do want to draw attention to the first line here. Habits are proportionate to powers since they are perfections of them. That's actually a nice starter definition for habit. When we come back to this in the spring semester, we'll begin there. That habits are the perfections of powers. This is a nice line. But otherwise, this objection doesn't do much for us. You could see it as a continuation of the Metaphysics Book 9 discussion from the previous article. So there's a lot of Metaphysics 9 running in the background of this whole question. His reply doesn't really give us anything that we need concretely for ethics. It does say something nice about the relation between powers and habits again, and it does make an interesting claim about means and end in art. But this is an objection where if you can get something out of it, if it's useful to you, if you can read it and intuit something from it and the reply is helpful, great, use it. But if not, don't worry about it. You can skip it. The said contra, though, does take a little bit of work. We've never seen one quite like this because we're not really citing an authority. Or I guess we've seen one of those before, but here we're actually giving more of an argument. In natural things, it is by the same power that a thing passes through the middle space, the media, and arrives at the terminus. But the means, again, in Aquinas, that's those things which are toward an end, ea quae sunt ad finem, are a kind of middle space, or media, through which one arrives at the end of the terminus. Therefore, if voluntas is of the end, it is also of the means. Interesting little short proof, and hopefully you can recognize something we talked about in the beginning of this class, which is Physics Book 5. When we start talking about changes, one of the things we want to talk about is the way the change begins and that middle process, the becoming phase of the change, and its end state, when the change is completed. And here we're just exploiting that very idea and saying that, again, from physics to ethics, ethics is a kind of change. The unact of the will is a kind of change. And so we're going to find the same basic rules of beginning, middle, and end. Well, when you walk across a room, or when you heat something up, it's not two different powers involved. The walking across the room power and the now I've arrived at the door power, it's just walking. It's one power. When you're heating up a piece of wood, it's not one power by which the wood is now 450 degrees and a different power by which it approaches 450 degrees. It's all just one power. So we have the same thing here in ethics, right? In an act of the will, no different. We have a middle space which is the crossing to an end, and it's all one power. Midspace works the same. The word media I keep putting up on the screen to show you that this is why we call ea que sunt ad finem. It's why we call it means. Mean just means middle. And think about it in terms of math. Mean and median are two different ways of identifying the middle of a group of numbers. Right? You can find a sort of abstract middle by adding them all up and dividing by the total number of members. That's one kind of middle. And you have a slightly more concrete, substantial form of middle where you line up all the numbers and pick the one in the middle. But fundamentally, mean and median just mean middle. And that's why we say that the means, those things which are toward an end, are means. We're saying they're a middle. Now, the respondeo is a bit long. We're going to break it up into several slides. And we begin very bluntly with the distinction that we raised in the previous article. When Aquinas was replying to one of the objections, and the translator gave his little note, now we have Aquinas' justification for that translation. This is why we use the word volition to name one particular thing. Because the word voluntas sometimes designates the power of the will, the ipsa potentia qua volumus. Sometimes it names the act of the will, the voluntatis actus. And I think it is worth spending a little bit of time looking at what's going on with the Latin there. When we say power in this class, in Aquinas, in this video series, it will always mean a potency. We don't mean the strength of the will or the intensity of your willing, how much you will something. We'll never mean that. We mean the power by which we want something. We mean a potency anytime we use the word power. So I think you should be a little careful about throwing the word power around just as an English language usage. Be aware that we will always mean a potency, V on a diagram. And so we can mean either the power by which we will or the potency, or we can mean its act. Now, if you're going to explain Aquinas, or if you're going to read it and understand it, you have to understand the importance of the distinction. He's going to give two answers. If he gives a distinction, then he's going to give you two answers. An answer that corresponds with the first branch of the distinction and an answer that corresponds with the second branch of the distinction. If you're taking this class for credit and need to take quizzes and give me good explanations of things, you need to make sure first and foremost that your explanation always follows his distinction. Have to. So if we talk about the will as a power, the power by which we will, then the simple answer is that it covers both. The will as a power extends to both means and end. This is the first branch of the distinction. And now he just gives a generic account of powers. It might be helpful, we're not going to do it, but you know how to look it up. It might be helpful to go check out where Aquinas gives a general account of how powers and acts and objects work, and how they line up. This is in the Prima Pars, question 77, when he's getting, this is early on in getting through the powers of the human soul or the rational soul. You might find that helpful. But here we're just going to make the following claim. It's a little bit interesting, probably worth some further discussion in class. Every power extends to those things in which may be considered the aspect of the object of that power in any way whatsoever. Example, sight extends to all things whatsoever that are in any way colored. So for Aquinas, the proper object of sight is color, and light is that by which we see it. We could probably go very far down the rabbit hole trying to talk about Aquinas' account of vision. And I actually think it's worth drawing a line in the sand and insisting that his way of talking about the relation between light and color is not bad. It is certainly different than the way we like to talk about wavelength. And we would just say light is the proper object of vision. Aquinas' way is a little bit more subtle than what he's written here. He says more things. And we may want to return to this, maybe even fight about it a little bit in class. But this video will become hopelessly long if we spend too long on it. The basic idea here is that the proper object of powers can contain some kind of diversity. So the proper object of sight is color, and that means whether that's white light or white and black, or Roy G. Biv and breaking things up into all of its wavelengths, however you want to think about it or talk about it, there's a great deal of diversity in the object of color or in the object of the visible. Maybe all powers work that way, and maybe not. I am sort of curious to know how we would talk about hearing in this regard. Is there a diversity contained within the within the object of hearing? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure Aquinas ever really addresses that. I don't know enough about Aristotle to know if he does either. But when we apply it to the will, it's fairly simple. The aspect of the good, which is the object of the will, as we discussed in question 8, Article 1, the aspect of the good can be found not only in the end, but also in the means. The just good and the good for. They're both good. And so they are both found. The means and the end are both contained in the power of the will, or the willing as a power. We can pursue this more in class if you like. A little bit interesting. Now, the second branch is unfortunately quite a lot more text, and I can't really put that much up on the screen. So we'll break this up into a couple more slides. If we've talked about the will as a potency or a power, now it is left to talk about the will as its act, the actus voluntatis. And here the answer is, very simply, it is of the end only. So the will as a potency regards both, and the will as an act, the actus voluntatis, is only of the end. And as usual, he tells you that up front, gives you his conclusion, and then explains. And he explains with just a general account of potency and the proper acts of powers of the soul. The fact that powers and proper acts of powers share a name for Aquinas, for Aristotle, that's a feature, that's intentional. So we talked about this a little bit in question 8, Article 1, where we have remnants of it in English with sensing is the act of sense, and willing is the act of the will, things like that. But we're not consistent with it, and there's easy grounds for confusion. But for Aquinas, that's very much on purpose. Every act denominated from a power, meaning named from the power, has sharing the same name, designates the simple act of that power. Thus, to understand names the simple act of the understanding, that's intellect. Intellectus designates simple act of intellect. Now, the simple act of a power, for any power, the simple act is always regarding the object of the power in itself, not in reference to anything else. You should recognize the language here of simply and in a certain respect from question 6, Article 6, when we were talking about fear. That's why I harped on it back then. It's for this moment. We're going to use it a lot. So when we're considering the object in itself, not in relation to other things that might be considered by that power, then you're talking about the simple act of that power. Well, for the voluntas, the object is the good, so the simple act of the voluntas must regard the good in itself, not in reference to anything else, not in relation to another. But when you talk about something being good in itself, or willed in itself, or wanted in itself, and not for the sake of anything else, you're talking about an end. And therefore, properly speaking, voluntas is of the end itself. That's just what end means, good and willed in itself. And this is why we can justify, I think, using the word volition to name this act. Volition is of the end only. We're just going to invent a word to distinguish between the power and the act. All right, well, when you are willing something not only in itself, or wanting something, or taking something as a good, not only in itself, but in reference to another, then you're talking about the means. And that's the other part of this. Again, means for Aquinas is eaque sunt ad finem. So those things which are toward an end, really sort of contains the answer within it, are willed not in themselves, but as referred to the end. They are ad finem. So the will is directed to them only insofar as it is directed to the end. Or to put it another way, what it wills in them is the end. When you're willing a thing as a means, you're willing the end in that thing. You're willing that thing as a way to get to it. So you are willing it, but it's derivative, it's secondary, it's in reference to the end. And that means you're actually, when you willing means, you're willing both. And that's very important for Article 3. One reason to focus on this and to try to belabor some of the points in this respondio is that question 8, Article 3 is going to elaborate on this. And if you understand it here, then Article 3 is a lot easier. You have to make some of your headway now, otherwise Article 3 can be a little challenging. You do have to be careful not to confuse means, the way Aquinas means it, and the things themselves, right? The phrase eaque sunt ad finem. The focus is sunt ad finem. That's the part that matters. They are toward an end. It's not that they exist as substances or as things that we're thinking about them. Obviously, the pen just exists as a pen. You could use it for lots of things. But when I want the pen so that I can write on the board, I'm willing it as a means. I want it for something. So when we call something a means, we're not calling it an object. We're calling it something in relation to the mind, something in relation to the will, something in relation to an end. The final block of text here is him applying this also to the understanding, the intellect. And I think it's actually useful to run through it, in part because I just want you to understand how the intellect works for Aquinas. Quite useful for what we'll be doing in the next few questions. Properly speaking, to understand the first act of the intellect is directed to those things that are known in themselves, the object of the intellect in itself, not with reference to another. Aquinas calls these first principles. But when we're talking about knowing things not in themselves, but through others, by combining first principles and reasoning from them, now that's another act of the intellect. That's the third act. That's reasoning. And that's not, properly speaking, understanding anymore. Except that, very much like with the will, we are understanding the conclusions through something, in the same way that we are willing the means, we're willing the end in the means. So there's some similarities there, but this is bonus. This is not quite as critical for what we're going to do right now. But when we get into practical reason in the next few questions, thinking about this a little bit more will help you. And you should recognize that reply to objection 2 is just a continuation of that last slide. We're really just talking about the way, the last couple of slides, the way means and end are, it's not quite correct to do what the objector did. The objector wanted to emphasize that means and end are different kinds of good. And that's right, but they're not different kinds of good in the same way that sound and color are different kinds of sensible. There are different powers for objects that differ in genus and are on an equality, that are equally members of the genus, that don't depend on each other or aren't oriented toward each other in any way. For instance, sound and color are different genera of sensibles to which are referred the powers of hearing and sight. And that's what this diagram here is on the right. So we have two different kinds of sensibles. Sound, that's one kind of sensible, and color. That's another kind, species 1 and species 2. And sound and color aren't oriented toward each other. It's not, one doesn't exist for the sake of the other. They're just equally, separately, species of sensible. There correspond to them, therefore, two different powers of sense, where we have hearing corresponding with the object of sound, and we have sight corresponding with the object of color. And the powers, hearing and sight, are, again, equally genera or kinds of sense or species of sense. Aquinas isn't always super strict, and neither will I be, in the difference between genus and species. It's not quite that rigid classification system that we will later develop and use in, say, biological classifications. So that's the way it works when you have kinds of things that are equally kinds of things, and you might say sort of independent of each other. But that's not the way the useful and the honest good work. The bonum utile and the bonum honestum are not on an equality, but are as that which is of itself and that which is in relation to another. So the bonum utile only means anything. It only is good in reference to the bonum honestum, which doesn't apply when you talk about sound and color. Such objects are always referred to the same power. And now you get another look at the way he talks about sight. Right? If you think about sight, light and color, you talk about light and color, then you're starting to get closer to the way you talk about the useful good and the honest good. Sight perceives both color and the light by which color is seen. And you can start moving in the direction of talking about light more like the way we would now. And again, we can play the light game independently. We don't have to worry about that, I think. But this is very much like the previous slide when we were talking about the intellect, that which is known in itself and that which is known through those things which are known in themselves. So that's the mistake the objection was making, overlooking this equality side and the fact that here the useful and the honest are hierarchically ordered, one to the other. And that's not the way, say, senses work. And that's it. That's the entirety of question 8, article 2. Again, we're not going to look at the replies to 1 or 3. You should be able to go back and see how reply to 1 is trivial. Objection 1 is easily answered in the article itself. And objection 3, again, that's bonus for you guys if you can make sense out of it. We still want to go on to say a little bit more about the way means and end are related to each other and the way we will them. And that's with this slightly techie question in Article 3, whether they are willed with one and the same act or with 2 separate acts. And if you understand what we've talked about here, it's actually pretty easy to follow along what he does in Article 3. But it is a little bit more of a challenging article. In the meantime, if you've got any questions on this article, feel free to drop a comment below or reach me on Discord or in class. And otherwise, good luck with your studying and God bless.